been a series of warnings from the National Treasury in different ways that government departments will be getting less money in the near future and that, in fact, they might have to cut back drastically on what they spend. Yesterday, SARS said the tax take, the amount of money it's receiving through tax, may be around 50 billion rand less than was predicted for this financial year. Matthew Parks is COSATU's parliamentary officer. Matthew, good afternoon to you. We've seen all sorts of fairly consistent reporting on this. If government is running out of money, does it have any other option but to cut back on spending?
Look, I think for us, we want to go to the fundamental problem that's put us into a crisis. We've been raising the alarm bells COSATU since 2019. We're in a crisis because of the mismanagement of the state, the collapse of state-owned enterprises and municipalities, load shedding, the cable theft crippling Transnet and so forth. So if we want to stabilize the fiscus, we have to stabilize the revenue. And the revenue is in a crisis because of those fundamental issues. I think for us, it's not about cutting, and one can cut to one's heart's delight. But you'll still be in a crisis unless you deal with the fundamental obstacles facing the economy. Simply just cutting the expenditure of the state, yes, it may look pretty on a balance sheet. It might actually worsen the capacity of the state to deliver public services that the economy needs to grow. And it might simply just be a little better than giving Panados to a patient who needs chemotherapy treatment.
There's some Panados that maybe you and I can agree on, which is that I wonder if we could cut back on the VIP protection unit, for example, and some of the government institutions that seem to have really bloated salaries for their CEOs.
No, definitely would agree. And we've been calling for that for years. We don't need to have 3,000 police officers deployed to the VIP protection unit to defend about 200 politicians, some of whom you and I have never even heard of, a Deputy Minister of Arts and Culture, for example. We think those police officers could rather be deployed to where they are trained, to provide onto police stations, to specialized policing units like detectives and visible policing, etc., where the community really needs them. There's no need to pamper politicians' egos excessively. And there is a proliferation we've seen across the state of some ministries. We don't need 28 ministries. We could have 20. We don't need 34 deputy ministers. We should rather have maybe about 5. We shouldn't have about 10,000 councillors. Perhaps we could do with half of that. And of course, we've been long raising the issue of the proliferation of entities across the state because they fall outside of the public service wage regime in the collective bargaining place. You often be amazed, Stephen, that you have CEOs and even management of some of these entities, like the Road Traffic Management Corporation, which just dispenses some traffic tickets, who earn more than the president of the entire country. So there is a space to have some discussions. We think there is a space to redeploy and reprioritize expenditure. But let's do things in a smart way, which protects the poor, empowers, working class people like nurses and teachers and so forth, allows them to survive, and really rebuilds the state and grows the economy. But we shouldn't go for decapitation of the patient. We should rather have a surgical incision approach rather.
Okay, let me play the role of fiscal hawk for a moment, because I think this might be important. You point to various reasons why government is in this fiscal crisis, and all of that's true. Let me add some facts to what you say, which is that people working in government also received above-inflation pay increases for a very long time before the pandemic. Their salaries did go up by more than inflation. And isn't that also why we're in this situation? Because government gave them above-inflation increases. Government workers, your members sometimes, got too much money, Matthew.
Not really. So if you look at, don't take my figures, take Treasury's figures for the budget. The wage bill in terms of the budget of government since 2009 has been always at 35% of the budget. That's on average for international governments across the world. It hasn't gone up above 35%. It's been relatively stable there. And it's a bit difficult, for example, to compare with workers in the private sector because you don't have farm workers in the public sector. In the public sector, you've got doctors, nurses, paramedics, teachers, police officers, and so forth, who really constitute the overwhelming majority of public service. For example, about 35% of the public service is teachers. You do want to retain them because if you pay them peanuts, sometimes the opposition parties might want to say, what happens then is that you spark a brain drain. And we're already really suffering a significant brain drain. You find that doctors complete the community service and the public service. After a year, they leave the country, they go overseas to better paying jobs. You find a brain drain of teachers going to the private sector, to private schools, far less stressful, better paying jobs. So we need to find the right balance. Of course, we appreciate the state doesn't have unlimited resources. We've been raising alarm bells as COSATU that we need to get the state onto a financially sound trajectory. We don't want to see the debt getting out of control. We don't want to see government collapse or go to the IMF because that will be the worst case scenario for everybody, for government, for workers, for businesses, and so forth. But the real cause of the fiscal crisis is a crisis at Transnet and Eskom. You have to resolve those if you want to stabilize the fiscus. But simply pickpocketing nurses of the already quite meager wages is not going to fix transit, is not going to fix ESCOM or municipalities. And it will be in the same crisis year after year. And this is the point we had made to Tito Mboweni when he was Minister of Finance in 2020, when he imposed a wage freeze and then instituted about 3 years of below inflation increases. It hasn't resolved the issue. In fact, the economic crisis are getting worse because we're not dealing with the fundamental cancers of Transnet, of ESCOM, of municipalities, and so forth.
So, Matthew, I accept that you use nurses as the example and Kasatu and people making your argument. I would use nurses too as my example, and police officers, by the way, and teachers. But there are others. So let me describe, for example, what happens when people go and get a driver's license, how they're treated by officials there. If you go to your local council to try and have a bill sorted out, in many cases you'll be told someone's not available or it can't be done today. Go to the post office. You can't get anything done at the post office, frankly. The point I'm trying to make is that you can say nurses all you like, but there's a very large number of people in the state who, from what ordinary South Africans see, don't work. Let me put that into sort of more polite language. Productivity is an issue. And I think many people would suggest the private sector, workers in the private sector, are far more productive than many, not all, but many workers in the government sector. And surely there is an obligation on of workers in the government sector to be more productive than people in the private sector because it's government money.
Look, there'll be no argument about that. Workers, too, because some members are workers and they go to home affairs, they sit in long queues, they go to hospitals, they stand in queues the whole day. Everybody's frustrated by that. And yes, there are performance management systems in government, and management must manage. That's why we hire management. So I think that's a failure management. But part of the issue also is two other fundamental crises affecting the state's capacity. One is, for example, the infrastructure. So at home affairs, half the reason why there's long queues is because the IT system is offline half the time. It's an IT-based system. You also find you have got long queues at home affairs or hospitals, etc., because where you should have had maybe 10 staff on duty processing ID applications and so forth, you've actually got 4 or 5 staff. So the queues naturally double. We've had a freeze on vacancies being filled for the past 2 years, and that really has sparked a huge crisis in the state. And also, Stephen, if you look at, just take a step back in history, in 1994 we had 34 million South Africans. We had 1 million public servants. Today we have about 1.2 million public servants and almost 60 million South Africans. So the ratio is almost doubled. And this is really why you're finding that the public services are breaking at the seams, because we're not having the right ratio. So the teacher, the police, the doctor, nurse ratio to client is doubling, and of course is breaking point. So yes, people are right to be frustrated. No one cannot be frustrated studying to get your driver's license the whole day. We need to invest in the capacity of the state to modernize it. A lot of these things should actually be online. That will help ease the pressure on customers, on staff, etc. But I think for us it's about having to deal with many crises and not just choosing which crisis to do and which ones to ignore. It's a tough issue because we have so many crises at once, but I think for us it's about having to deal with all of them if we're really to turn society around. Maybe the last example on this one is that you look at South African Revenue Service. We went through a terrible period of state capture under the previous administration. They appointed competent management. They invested in the IT capacity. They employed additional 500 staff. And as a consequence, in the last financial year, SARS was able to increase tax compliance from 61 to 64%. And this generated an additional 94 billion rand for the state. So it shows you the value of investing in quality public services. It has a benefit to society, to businesses, to the economy, to workers at large.
Matthew, there are various reports about what's going on. We hear about a secret, but everybody knew about it, meeting between government ministers and the president at a wine farm. I don't know why anyone thinks that anything that happens at a wine farm would be secret, but there we are. There's some suggestions that, in fact, there might even have been meetings involving Kasatu. That something may happen through NEDLAC at this. Is there any sort of communication between you and government, between you and the finance minister about this?
Yeah. So look, we saw the reports in the last 2 weeks about the wine farm. We first saw the circular from the government, from Treasury to departments to freeze vacancies, freeze the infrastructure expenditure, trips, catering, etc. And we'd have no problem freezing trips or catering. It's an obvious thing. We'd actually want to go further and scrap the consultants to insource services. But we also saw the weekend reports about plans to close certain departments, to reduce the headcount, to raise VAT. Some of those things we think are simply mad. Raising VAT is a regressive tax. It hits the poor, suffocate the economy. Allowing people early retirement or voluntary severance packages, that can be fine, maybe. But if it goes hand in hand with the freezing on vacancies, then that's going to cripple the state's capacity to deliver public services and make it even worse. We have met with the presidency today. They wanted to just give us updates around ESCOM and Transit. We also have raised this issue. We're going to meet with them again to find out exactly what is Treasury proposing. We've made proposals from our side about how can we turn the ship around. We think one thing is to generate additional revenue for the state. Let's give more resources to SARS. But again, to our point that we have to deal with the real cause of our crisis, which is around Transit and ESCOM, Metro Rail, the municipalities, the corruption, the crime, etc. And we shouldn't be looking for low-hanging, easy fruit, which is simply the wage bill. The wage bill will be stabilized if we stabilize the state and the economy. But thinking we can stabilize the wage bill without fixing the economy, it's a mission to nowhere.
Matthew Parks, thank you very much indeed. From COSATU, I have a sneaking suspicion, Matthew, not the last conversation you and I are going to have on this issue. So many different elements to it about what is happening with government's finances at the moment.